Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second session of Connections Online 2023. This is the What is Red Teaming panel. Early on, when myself and Brant Guillory and Zach Grant and Merle Robinson decided that we wanted to do a discussion about red teaming, that we wanted it to be the theme of the conference, I realized quite early on that we needed to have a panel about what do we mean by red teaming. And that's because red teaming, red cell, those phrases that are used by multiple disciplines, but all the different disciplines have a tendency to mean different things by it. And one of the recurring themes I've run into over the years is people using a phrase, everybody around the room nods in agreement because they're familiar with that phrase, but nobody is really communicating because everybody means something different by it. And because red teaming is definitely one of those phrases, early on in the conference, I wanted to have a panel where we talk about what people mean by red teaming. So we have with us today Dr. Sean Barnett from RAND, Nina Kollars. Dr. Kollars, where are you? What's your current affiliation? I've forgotten.
I'm currently with an advisor to the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, the Honorable Heidi Shue. Okay. But I'm potentially will return to PME, to the professional military education environment soon.
Okay. We have Mr. Steve Sallott, who's a former Leavenworth Red Teamer. We've got Doug Clifford, who's also a former Army officer from the University. Okay, let me make sure I get this right. University of Albany, right?
Correct.
Okay, that's good because I had that wrong the other day and people gave me shit for it. And then hopefully we'll also have Chip Sayers, who's a retired Red Cell person from a large intelligence organization located in Langley, Virginia. So to start off, let's go to Sean Barnett. Sean's got a few slides for us to sort of talk about red teaming from a wargaming perspective. So over to you, Sean.
Thanks very much, Chris. Good morning, everyone. And as Chris said, I'm going to talk to you a little bit this morning about red teaming in wargaming, and what I mean by that specifically is playing the adversary in professional war games. And you see on the slide there, 4 of the bad guys we're often concerned about in running professional war games. I'm going to talk about how we generate and use their capabilities in professional war games. Next slide, please. So this is what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to cover sort of what are the goals in playing red when you're setting up a war game, designing a war game. What do you want the red team or the red cell to do? I'm going to talk about how to play red, what exactly you need to do to develop and run red capabilities in a game. Excuse me. I'm going to talk about who typical red players are, who are these people who do this. Talk a little bit about researching red, how to find information on red capabilities. And then finally, some of the pitfalls that are commonly encountered in running red in professional war games. And just to sort of reiterate the caveat, everything I'm going to say here today is these are my views, not the views of my employer or the U.S. government. Next, please. So what are the goals in playing red in a war game? Really, it's representing the adversary, excuse me, in accordance with the game scenario. And this is the game that the game designer and the sponsor are setting up to explore some military question, like what if the Russian army was fighting NATO armies in Eastern Europe? What if China was trying to invade Taiwan under different circumstances? That's a game scenario. And you want to develop the red force so that it will fit into that scenario. And those things you want to develop are red capabilities, the military capabilities of the red force, the military objectives of the red force, for example, taking Taiwan, for example, occupying part of the Baltic states, and then the concepts of operation. How is the red force going to actually carry out the military mission that you've set out for it within the game? The next thing you want to think about are the circumstances under which the game is occurring. And these are determined by the game sponsor or the game designer. And they can include a few things. They could be, you might be looking for a prediction or a best estimate of what you think might happen if a conflict were to take place under certain circumstances at a certain time in the future. For example, an invasion of Taiwan in 2030, you might want to know, what your best estimate is of how that would turn out. But you also might be interested in running hypotheticals. So you might say, well, I want to run a future case, but I'm going to make certain assumptions about the Red capabilities or about the Red force that might not hold today. So I might assume that maybe they've developed better technology than they have today or than what is expected today. Maybe they've changed their doctrine from what they have today or what is expected today. And so that's another aspect of running the Red force, playing the Red force. There might be hypotheticals that you want to address within the game. And then the last thing is playing so as to meet the objectives of the game. And those can be exploring or assessing a military situation where the Red players might have more freedom to do what they want with the capabilities that they have, just to see what's possible within a military situation. Or you might be looking to demonstrate or communicate the expected interactions or sequences of events if the sponsor or the game designer has a belief or an interest in how things might turn out, like for example, a particular invasion of Taiwan carried out in a particular way, then the Red play might be more constrained so as to carry out those things that are envisioned, to demonstrate them through the use of a war game, also to enable them to be communicated to others, and it convey the understanding that the sponsor or the game designer might have before actually designing and running the game. Next, please. So how to play Red? How do you develop the capabilities that you'll want to have in your war game? And what I have listed here are elements of military capabilities that we commonly look at in the US when we're exploring the development of US capabilities. And these are sometimes referred to as .MLPF factors. And you see them there: doctrine, organization, training, material or hardware, leadership, personnel, facilities, and then policies that might bear on capabilities. And then finally, if you're looking at a longer term game, you might also be concerned about the industrial base of the adversary and its ability to generate or regenerate forces in the long run. So you want to look at all of those things when you're considering what the Red force will have, so that you have an accurate representation of it. Because military capability is more than just hardware, it's more than just people, it's more than just doctrine. All of these things come to bear on how a military force would or could operate in the event of a conflict. Next, please. So, and then after you develop the capabilities, you think about how to employ the capabilities in pursuit of the adversary's objectives within the bounds of the game's condition and guidelines. These will include the physical capabilities we just talked about, human factors that can often influence how those physical capabilities are employed. These can be capabilities, they can be plans. Those things, if you've been following the war in Ukraine, have been very important, for example, in that the Russian forces perform particularly badly with respect to human factors. There can also be political military objectives that are specified for the game. For example, if you're playing a Russian invasion of the Baltic states, the Russian objective might be to grab a small piece of territory and hang on to it and force the NATO into a difficult situation, rather than trying to occupy large swaths of NATO countries. So those are things that influence how Red would be played during the game. And then finally, there's the scenario design. What do the game designer and the game sponsor intend for the conflict to be? If it's a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, Red should play a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, for example. Next, please. So who plays Red? Who does these things? And it's, in a general sense, it's people with the knowledge and skill to implement the guidance I've been talking about. And you can have more than one of them on a Red cell or on a Red team. And these people include intelligence specialists, if you're working with the government, people who specifically study Red military capabilities and look at raw intelligence information to try to develop an understanding of how Red could fight. There can be country specialists, both in the government or outside the government. For example, at RAND, we employ many country specialists for the different possible adversary countries that we might be involved in a conflict with. There are warfare area specialists, people who look at air, land, sea, space, cyber capabilities generally across many nations. They can also be employed as RED players as need be. And then finally, there are experienced generalists, wargamers, operational analysts, combat modelers, people who over the course of their experience often gain an understanding of how a RED force might fight. For example, Russia in the Baltics or China with an invasion of Taiwan. And you can employ them as well to run the RED team, particularly if you're running a game that's been run before and they've acquired some specific knowledge of what you want to look at. Next, please. So researching RED, how do you acquire the information necessary to develop and run a RED force in a war game? There can be primary sources if you can get access to them. These include adversary authored documents, if you can read them in their own language to understand what they've been saying about their own capabilities. This can include raw intelligence operation about how RED operates in conflicts and exercises, or what they're saying about each other's capabilities that can be very useful in developing an understanding of how they might fight. There are also secondary sources. The government, the US governments and other governments produce information on projected enemy capabilities. This is from intelligence community in the US and also the Defense Department services, the Joint Staff for the Office of the Secretary of Defense produce a wide range of documents on how what the enemy capabilities are and how they might fight. And there are private sector assessments that are prepared by think tanks, defense contractors, academia, the news media, and then unaffiliated individuals like mill bloggers that can also be very helpful. If you've been looking at the war in Ukraine, as we have at RAND, we've found that some of these private sector assessments and even open source assessments have been very helpful and well informed regarding the war and regarding Russian and Ukrainian military capabilities. Next, please. So what are some of the difficulties that are sometimes encountered in playing RED? And there are a few that I've outlined here that you probably want to avoid if you're running RED in a war game. The first one is insufficient RED freedom of action. If the game design constrains RED too much, then you might miss out on possible RED courses of action that could be threatening to blue allies and partners that you want to learn about in the game. So an overly constrained RED force might deprive you of that learning that you would otherwise get if RED had freer action. There can be a lack of RED creativity, and this is not a restraint imposed by the game, but you might have RED players through maybe lack of experience or long-term practice or sort of set in a particular way of fighting. And you also lose out on learning possibilities regarding possible actions that RED might take that the RED players might not be employing. There can be mirror imaging, and this is the assumption that RED will fight like blue. What we typically find is that RED does not fight like blue. They're not designed to fight like blue, and you want to be careful not to assume that, because again, you'll end up with possibly a misrepresentation of RED that could undermine your learning. Sometimes you see that the RED force will fail to take into account the effective enabling capabilities like sustainment or ISR and targeting on their combat capabilities. And sometimes you see overly focused game on combat capabilities when things like sustainment and ISR and targeting can have an important influence on what can actually happen in the course of a battle. So when you think about employing RED and really running a game generally, you want to think about the enabling capabilities as well as just the combat capabilities. Sometimes you see a failure to account for the effects of human factors on performance. Again, if you're overly focused on hardware and numbers and you're not taking a hard look at what the human factors are for the adversary, you can end up possibly misrepresenting their performance. And I think that happened before the war in Ukraine, that there were people looking at Russian capabilities, really focusing more on numbers and hardware, who missed the human factors and over-predicted the Russian performance in Ukraine. And then finally, with respect to preparation of RED, there can be inadequate research and capabilities generally, and that's just a need to you really need to do your homework before you design a RED force and put it on the table or on the map for a war game. And then lastly, and this is not really an aspect of the development of red. Sometimes war games involving red forces are poorly reported in that they don't discuss the game design and sort of why the red force performed the way it did, and they miss out on elements of the red force design that these kinds of things that we've been talking about that were taken into account, and they end up with a distorted image of red capability, either positive or negative, by neglecting things that really went into what red did and why. So again, if you're running a war game, you see these things, you want to kind of avoid them if you're designing red force for your war game. Next, please. All right, that concludes my presentation, and I'll be happy to take your questions in the Q&A session. Thanks very much.
Okay, so first of all, let's bring in Chip Sayers from the retired from the Culinary Institute of America. Thank you very much, Chip, for joining us. Second of all, I've decided I'm going to call an audible, and I've decided I'm going to ask each participant one direct question when they finished, and then we'll have sort of a general Q&A at the end. So Sean, could you talk a little bit from a wargaming perspective of how do you balance the necessity to focus Red's play in order to meet the analytical objectives versus giving them enough freedom of action that you're not actually scripting them? I say this as somebody who's had to deal with these sorts of issues, because on the one hand, you know, if you're defending a port and Red doesn't attack a port and it's all about port defense, then that doesn't help you meet your analytical objectives. But on the other hand, you don't want to railroad them. So
Sure thing. Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think you have to talk it through, that the game designer and the sponsor have to have a clear idea of what they want out of the game. So for example, if you want to defend a port, if you want to know about those capabilities and what red might do and what blue or green might do in defense, you need to make that clear to everybody involved in the game. Say, look, these are the general bounds of the exercise. It's going to be an attack upon a port. But then once you do that, you say, look, red, within these bounds, you're free to do whatever you want. These are your capabilities. These are the general circumstances of the game. You know, within that, you're free. You got to attack the port, but how you employ your capabilities is up to you. And for another example, the invasion of Taiwan, right? That's something that we look at, you know, frequently. And you could say to the China player, okay, you have to invade Taiwan. It's an actual invasion scenario. It's not a bombard and blockade scenario. But how you invade Taiwan is entirely up to you. Where you land, what you land with, what you do beforehand, what you do during, that's entirely up to you. So you just need to make that clear, I think, to everybody involved in the game to make sure you capture what you want, but don't overly constrain them. Chris, you're muted.
Yeah, and I told everybody that at least once there was going to be something where somebody forgot to unmute themselves. What I didn't say to everybody in the pregame was that there was like a 90% chance it was going to be me. So yeah, that's exactly the sort of answer that I would have given to that question. I'm a big believer in the idea that the blue NCA, National Command Authorities, and the red NCA are both the white cell. That when push comes to shove, they're the ones that are sort of making national policy for both sides in the game. So thanks, Sean. We'll come back and ask more questions later. In the meantime, let's go to Nina Kollars. Dr. Kollars is a cybersecurity sort of person. And if you could tell us about what red teaming means to your community, and you know, what those any differences that you might see between what you've heard so far and how your community views it.
That's excellent. Thanks for the question, and thanks to everybody for being here. It's always been a dream of mine to participate in Connections, and then just a couple pandemics later, you just quite haven't found the time. So I just want to say it's awesome. Okay, so what do I want to? So I'm very glad that we started, by the way, with Sean. You're jumping around, Chris. I'm glad we started with Sean because I wanted to. It gives me a nice counterpoint, a good way to kind of show what it is that the cybersecurity community is up to, and also to sort of talk about what we mean by red teaming. In conventional wargaming fashion, when you say what is red teaming for cybersecurity, the answer should be it depends. And so there's two general ways in which I tend to think about wargaming in the community. One is as a function of an actual service that's provided by cybersecurity professionals. And then the second is within the context of games at hacking conventions, things like ShmooCon or DEF CON or any of the sort of places where hackers who are often cybersecurity professionals, often other kinds of professionals, security professionals, come together to play games. And so both of those, I think, are relevant to the conversation here. And I think this sort of just as a top line key distinction when we talk about red teaming in cybersecurity, the thing with almost few limitations is that when we red team in cybersecurity, we're actually red teaming on top of the actual net infrastructure, the real world space itself. And so, in cybersecurity red teaming, everybody who is a part of the company or part of the department or organization, or anybody who is under whose security is in need of testing or scrutiny, you're all the target. Everybody's the target. And as a key distinction also, again, from thinking about red teaming in wargaming as opposed to what is a red team in cybersecurity, is that you're really, there's, with very few exceptions, blue is not allowed to fight back. Blue can defend, right? Blue can detect, can respond, but unless we're talking about other countries, blue is never allowed to fight back or to sort of counter cyber attack. That's completely illegal in most countries and in nearly every case in the United States. Having said that, so what is a red teaming cybersecurity workforce? So what they do is they take a series of commonly known, and sometimes uncommonly known cyber and then just regular hacker tricks, and they try and break into your security systems. That could be a digital attack. So that could be something more like systems or network scanning. There are toolkits out there that most companies use. Metasploit, if you're Googling around casually and trying to find a toolkit that people use for red teaming against companies and their security. And so tools like Metasploit have packed in a whole series of commonly known vulnerabilities and malicious software that have been purpose-built for common vulnerabilities in, say, Microsoft or the way you've configured your area network. And you can launch it, and it will try and leverage those attacks. What follows then is you document, because you're a professional, right? So you document all the ways in which you manage to defeat the security of that particular organization or network, and then you give it back to them as a report card that says, here's how security is going for you. So that's one kind of red teaming within cybersecurity, but increasingly over the past decade or so, they've built out the suite of what red teamers do to include more physical sort of perimeter building search, or things like social engineering or phishing, where they have people who may try and get close to you and clone your security cards. So for those of you who have CAC cards or security cards that allow you into buildings, red teamers will walk around with cloning capabilities, and they'll try and get close enough to you to clone your card to see if they can break into your building under your identity. They'll try and tailgate. Many what they call penetration testing teams, which are red teamers, are licensed and bonded locksmiths. So they can move into the space. They'll know way too much about your locks and your vaults and find ways to violate the security to see how well you've knitted together your security system. So the contemporary red team in cybersecurity terms is actually an all-purpose team using all sorts of skills. And it's rare anymore and sort of considered slightly cheap if you're just looking to buy a red team service to assess security purely from a digital perspective. And that's been a really interesting thing to grow and watch grow and professionalize over the year. The thing to know about penetration testing teams or the services is that these are fully insured, licensed, certified teams that are supposed to be top of class. but as with any service, so you get what you pay for. And so that's kind of the space. And it's also fair to say that red teamers are sort of the sexier side of cybersecurity. So it's a lot of fun. It's more fun to sort of break into things than it is to try and defend against them. So that a lot of people say that sort of it's unsexy to be a blue. It's unsexy to be a blue team defender, which is true. The work is a lot harder, and so there's a lot of sort of pizzazz that comes with being a red teamer. So that's kind of what it's like on a sort of an everyday basis. You too can become a pen tester if you want to, if you're good at breaking into buildings or climbing through windows or all sorts of things. You too can join such a team. But then there's a second way in which we talk about red teaming in the hacker world, which is when we go into our hacker spaces and play games. And I think this is also slightly irrelevant to what we think we're doing in wargaming. Having sort of formerly been at the Naval War College, and sort of thinking about how we model what an adversary is up to. So what's interesting about hacker spaces and hacker games is that the people who play red can be either representatives from an actual licensed bonded red teaming, pen testing community, but the hacker spaces are often designed that the game is the defender and the attackers are all the hackers who come to the hacker convention. And this is another interesting space in which, again, we're sort of playing in the real world. We're not playing necessarily on a real system unless the company wants to offer it up. But there's also this sort of real sense that when you wire the game together, because you're asking essentially sort of a whole bunch of feral engineers to come in and attack a system and break it for you, that construction of the game has to be not just thinking about all of the ways in which your hackers are going to come at the system, but how do you prevent them from breaking the game in the process of play? And this is a very common problem for all game design, right? Is what happens if your game players are sort of try to work outside the boundaries or sort of fight the scenario too much. The problem with hacker games and playing and hackers getting to play red is that you not only want to be careful that they don't break the game, but you also want to avoid prison in the meantime, which is that hackers will sort of willfully throw themselves at any challenge. And if you don't specifically tell them, hey, you can't cut a hole in that wall, they'll cut a hole in that wall, right? So you have to be careful of what you say is in scope and out of scope. So the funnier part of going to hacker cons and watching hacker games get played is that the rule system or the rule set over time gets longer and longer, the more rambunctious or the more sort of challenging the game gets. As the hackers get more and more frustrated, they will start crazier and crazier techniques to include sort of stealing your wallet, trying to get into your hotel room, that all these sorts of things start to emerge. And so one can imagine that the sort of what counts as in scope and out of scope is peculiarly and very importantly named in these games. And I will say that there's no small history of people being blackballed from hacker conferences for going just a little bit too far. So to emulate briefly what the prior speaker Sean did, I will say that so he had a red pitfalls section, and I thought, oh shoot, this is a really good put. And so I think the primary sort of struggles you're going to find with cybersecurity or hacker red teaming or red gaming is that you're going to have to, so that the scope of what you're after matters. So on the professional side, the scope of work, because you really are attacking employees, employee systems, sort of company security systems, the scope of work is what protects you. And so making sure that those guardrails are on, that it's very clear, what am I allowed to attack? How am I allowed to attack it? Because the red teamer can do whatever they want within that scope. So it's a little bit different, right? We don't have to map what the capabilities are at first. We just have to have a really clever red teamer. And then we say, whatever you do, don't break into the banking or the financials. Whatever you do, you're not allowed to cut the locks, right? And then you let your red teamer go and try and find the seams or the gaps in your security system. So you want to make sure that the scope is very clean. Otherwise, professional red teamers will go to jail, right? So that's part of why they have an insurance. That's why they're certified. But if you operate outside the scope, the company can sue you, and you could be facing jail time. It's at a minimum some pretty hefty fines. The other thing that to think about when we talk about what's the relevance of what's happening, because again, when you do these red team hits, people are stringing together cleverly constructed vulnerabilities, and they're exploiting them, right? And the thing you want to be careful with is what am I learning from that? So if you get an attack that's too clever by half, right? If it just so happens that someone manages to socially engineer a password out of one of your employees who's maybe just been in a car accident, right? Like, this is a very unique case. It's a little bit tragic and probably not appropriate. So you have to watch out when you're trying to learn from what Red is up to, when you have to ask yourself, how likely is this? And I know this happens all the time in wargaming, right? So this occurred, I guess that's right. The dice rolled that way, but what's the likelihood that this could play out in real life? And you want to watch out for that when you're trying to learn anything from what Red is up to in cyber. And then the most important thing is that when you launch a red team on anything, whether that's a game or whether it's a professional environment, you have to worry about very angry employees and very angry hotel owners. These conference spaces and the people upon which you play can have a pretty negative reaction to having sort of too robust play from your red team. And with that, I'll pause my comments and look forward to listening to everybody else. Thank you.
Okay, so that's a good comment from Mark Hitchcock, a good question there about war games that can effectively incorporate the effects of cyber activities on a war game. Let's hold off on that for just right now, though, because two quick comments, and then I do have a question for you. The first comment is that as I'm seeing a lot of robust question and answers taking place in the comments. So thank you, everybody, for that. Keep that coming. We'll get to everybody eventually. The second thing is when you were talking about how the hackers throw themselves into the process of trying to do penetration testing. I very much was reminded of surface warfare officers who were playing red, who were specifically trying, or actually in this case they were playing blue, but they were trying to cheat by getting into the red chat rooms for the exercise. So anybody who's been at sea with the US Navy during an exercise recognizes those personality traits. So my question for you is, it sounds like what you described in a lot of ways was sort of a blitz type of attack, right? Looking for all the different vulnerabilities there. And that certainly makes sense because you're hiring a red team. If you're a company and you're trying to see where your vulnerabilities are, you want them to cover a wide waterfront. It's not really about them trying to, exfiltrate the money that they're going to use to, go live off in the Caribbean or something like that. It's really about finding out where all the holes are. But it would also seem to me that there's probably a little bit more of a process there, because you certainly don't want to alert blue too early in advance that you're looking at a particular area. So can you talk just a little bit about what their thought process is when they try to sequence attacks?
Excellent. That's great. Thanks for asking. So orchestration of a conventional penetration test is incredibly important, and that starts several weeks in advance. I have a cat, sorry. Or you're welcome if you like. So orchestration of the sequence of how you want to get after it. So the step one of any actual pen test, particularly if it is a sort of not just a digital one. Digital ones you can sort of get away with, just sort of launch your tool, see how it goes. But if you're looking at a really robust test, then the pen test team will work across all modes. So one, they will do whatever they can to figure out, they'll do sort of intel gathering open source online. They'll try and figure out who your employees are. They'll work from your website. Then they will start to, again, if permitted and in scope, they will, in fact, often weeks in advance, follow several of your employees around to see if they can get a better sense of what the daily life is. So it's a very much like an intel gathering weeks in advance look, both at the networks, the machines that are being used inside the company, and the day-to-day security. And then they stack it all together. They plan a day when they're going to go in and they play it through, up to and including sort of finding out where blueprints can be. So it's a very sort of Ocean's 11 or MI5 operation. And usually the actual physical pen test of being on premises will last sort of only a matter of minutes if the team is lucky, right? Because the team just needs to get in, plant some malicious software or grab some data and then leave. But most of that prep work happens weeks in advance. It's pretty grueling, apparently. Lots of broken arms and lots of people getting the cops called on them because they're lurking a little too strongly. But yeah, it's an interesting profession. I think anybody who wants to sort of do that work, it's not a game for the faint of heart.
Okay, thank you. I'm really looking forward to the conversation we're all going to have when we get to that point. So one quick little admin note for those of you who are watching when the screen was bopping back and forth. That's what happens when the moderator has his hands on the controls at the same time as the producer, which I'm not supposed to be doing that. But I thought that there was an issue when in reality, the producer was going, oh, I should probably make the speaker the big person, because I forgot that we were in the individual presentation part of this rather than like everybody having a conversation at once. And I was trying to avoid jumping around, but it was totally and completely appropriate. Zach, I owe you a beer for not, yelling in frustration, or at least for having your microphone off while you were yelling in frustration about that. And so now I'm going to keep my hands off the controls and turn it over to Chip Sayers to talk a little bit about what red cell stuff means from his perspective, because when I first met Chip, it turns out Chip and I had been orbiting each other for about a decade, but had never actually met, didn't even really know of each other's existence until such a time as I got called upon to go help him with a red cell product he was doing. So Chip, tell us about red cell.
Okay. I had a full career in the IC, including 16 and a half with Defense Intelligence Agency. So, and I worked a lot with red teaming and war games for organizations like J8. So I can speak to that sort of thing. And I also developed and instructed war games for our new analysts. But what Chris wants me to talk about is the last 2 years of my career, my terminal assignment, I was on the CIA Red Cell. And that was without a doubt the most fun, most fulfilling, best job I've ever had. It was really great. So I think we're probably all familiar with the famous thing where on September 12th, 2001, George Tenet gets his big players together and says, I don't ever want to be surprised like this again. So we need to create some free thinkers, give them a sandbox to play in, and make sure that we test the boundaries so that this doesn't happen again. Somewhat later, when I joined Red Cell in 2012, I was brand new on the job, and so was General Petraeus. And he came down and talked to us about what he wanted us to do. And that's when we got the great quote about he wanted us to shock him. And, we all kind of looked at each other and said, yeah, we can do that. So that was kind of the standard. Now, having said that, someone has been quoted as, I'm trying to remember who it was, but, it was General Hayden, who had said, well, a lot of red cell stuff looked like science fiction. Well, quite frankly, we weren't allowed to just go out there and invent UFOs or something. whatever we did had to be plausible in some way. It might be stretching the boundaries a bit, but it had to be plausible, because you just get laughed off if you weren't dealing in the real world. And to that end, we generally worked pretty closely with the offices that covered the sandboxes we were playing in. If it had to do with a particular country, we would go to the regional offices and talk with them. Or if it had to do with, say, a weapon system, we would talk to the folks that were in charge of analyzing that weapon system. So, and in fact, shortly before I left Red Cell and retired, the National Intelligence Officer for, I think it was called Conventional Forces at the time. I don't remember what the title was exactly, but at any rate, he was actually a friend of mine from earlier in my career. And he asked me to look into a particular scenario. And I want to stop right now and say, unfortunately, I have to be pretty vague about this stuff, because CIA not only is worried about the the normal security concerns, they also have this thing where they don't want people to know what they're interested in. And so it's liable to be frustrating for the audience, but I'm just going to have to play with their rules, or I won't get to do this ever again. So at any rate, he asked me to look at a specific country that was giving us problems at that time, and postulate that they were doing something just for show, and that what they were up to was not real. And it's a question that had come across my mind before anyway, so I was ready to dig in. But what I couldn't do is just run off and write something crazy. I really needed to talk to the country experts about this program. And for one thing, if I made them angry, we wouldn't get their cooperation in the future. So there was a lot of trade-offs for these things. But anyway, they were telling me I was crazy. There was no way that could possibly happen. It just was not going to get their not just approval, but even their, even a nod. They would not go for this. And I went back to the NIO and I said, sorry, I can't write this because they're going to go off. And they've given me some good reasons why they don't believe this is possible. They're the experts. I kind of have to just bow to them and move along. The NIO was not happy about that, but I retired, so it doesn't matter anyway. But at any rate, the idea that we were running off the reservation, writing crazy stuff, was not at all true. In point of fact, while we did have the majority of our stuff was self-directed, where we came up with an idea and would write on it, or we were asked by a certain organization or individual to do a paper on something, we pushed very hard for analysts from the line intelligence shops to come and write a piece under our auspices, but to do it themselves, or do a cooperative effort with us. So the Red Cell was, offered a lot of opportunities for some interesting work, but one of the things it didn't do was go crazy and just invent stuff that was just not going to pass muster with the experts in that field. There was one instance where I had we had Admiral Stavridis, who was SACUR at the time, come and visit us, and he asked me specifically because at that time I was the analyst from the Weapons Intelligence Center. He asked me to do a particular paper, and so I got a tasking that way. General Petraeus, when he came down that time, he wanted to know what we were all working on. And ironically, when I told him what I was working on, he went, I don't think so. I don't think that's going to be very interesting. And it did take some massaging, but that ended up being my second most important paper while I was there. And just to go down that rabbit hole for a minute, all of our products were done electronically. I don't think we sent stuff to the printers, really. I mean, very small number for the really high level people who couldn't figure out how to work a computer. But at any rate, they were able to track who was reading our stuff and, put metrics on it. And I had a string going for a while where I was breaking a lot of the records that Red Cell had set for readership. I have to say that the second biggest paper Red Cell ever did was written by one of my colleagues while I was there. And he had an interesting premise, and he used some very innovative graphics that were just coming online. So I don't hold the record, but I did some fun work. And speaking of graphics, in what's his name? I'm trying to think of the guy who wrote the book on Red Team. Anyway, it's a good book. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. He talked about there was a piece that Red Cell had done that was made up like a graphic novel, but it was never published. And that's true. We had this piece hanging on the wall when I arrived there. But my first paper, the deputy of Red Cell said, "This is really fascinating. Oh, by the way, we're going to do this as a graphic novel." So we actually did put out a, what essentially looked like a graphic novel. And that was ended up being my biggest seller, if you will. But it was a fantastic job, and primarily because we were given a lot of leeway. We did have bounds on our job, but we were given an awful lot of leeway of subjects to pick up and run with, and it was great. Excellent job. Had a lot of fun with it, and frankly, I think we did some good. I had a piece that went in President Obama's President's Daily Briefing. I believe that was the first time a Red Cell had been put in the PDB, although presidents had seen them before. And that was an interesting piece, which he chose to completely ignore. So it's too bad, because I could have solved a big problem for him that haunted him his whole rest of his administration.
It's the nature of red cell work and the nature of intel work. So
yeah, absolutely.
So before we get to the question, I want to pull back a little bit and give a little bit of context here for exactly what it is, the sort of the role of red cell in the intelligence community. It is generally the case. There's wide error bars on what I'm about to say, but it is generally the case that there's a lead agency for most topics. Everybody knows who that lead agency is. And so basically, as you might imagine, if it's something involving navies and the Office of Naval Intelligence says the answer is X and other people say the answer is Y, the general belief is you go with X. And you might be able to file I strongly disagree, but the official position of the community would be X, because that's what ONI says. And so CIA is a little different from the standpoint that they work for the president. None of this, cabinet level official bullshit like the rest of us did, but they work directly for the president. And the other bit about Red Cell is that Red Cell is really, as I understand it, and Chip, if my understanding is too crude, feel free to offer some adjustments. Red Cell is really about asking the question, okay, this is the assessment we made, but what if we're wrong? What if we got that wrong? It's not saying, hey, I think that's wrong. It's let's just do a thought experiment about how this could be different. And it's like, nobody's going to come up and say, like, what if we're wrong about gravity and gravity doesn't exist? It's going to be something along the lines of, here's the argument that was made. Here, we have every reason to believe that argument is true, but what if these, you generally have to have a plausible path whereby you can get to a different conclusion. And if our conclusion is wrong, what are the implications of that? I know that was very much the type of thing that I got brought in to help with. Like Chip said, we're not going to go into the details of all of that, other than I'll say that I was a naval analyst. We're in a naval job. You can probably guess it had something to do with navies. So, Chip, any thoughts on that?
No, you're spot on. That's exactly what we were there for. Basically, it's not so much we were gonna tell people that they were wrong, but rather explore the options. And quite frankly, we just wanted, really at heart, to cause people to think and question their own assumptions. When I arrived at Red Cell, the Middle East guys had written something that I thought was pretty bad in my area of expertise. And I mentioned to the boss how basically they needed a spanking on that one. And she got really upset. It's like, ooh, I'm not hitting it off well here at the beginning of this relationship. But she reminded me that we were not there to correct people. We were there to cause them to think and correct themselves if necessary. But it wasn't our job to do, to administer spankings.
So causing people to think is, I'm going to make a prediction that causing people to think is going to be a really big theme in what Steve has to say to us in a few minutes. That having been said, so my question for you, Chip, is there any product that you did, or any product that any of your colleagues did, that had the impact of not, it seems to me that there's two different kinds of impacts that products like that can have. One is causing people to say, on second thought, maybe we didn't think this through. And the other one would be causing people to say, that's a very interesting contingency. Let's prepare for that contingency. So for either of those criteria, is there some, can you think of products and in general terms talk about them, however general you have to be, of situations where you achieve, first of all, is that a good goal? Is that the right way to think about it? And second of all, can you think of examples where you met those goals?
Okay, I think that's a good way to think about it. As far as, times we had success, that's a little more difficult to measure. Certainly, if you saw the number of hits you got on a piece was really high, that could indicate that it was causing people to think, but there was no way to know for sure. The all-time biggest red cell ever done was, I think, the one that came out right after bin Laden was killed. And so, that was a done deal, right? So what are you going to influence there? That was just a matter of people wanted to get whatever information they could. So the pure metrics of it were not suited to measuring, were we having that impact? Now, having said that, there were a couple of times when it was pretty clear that not necessarily that we're changing people's minds, causing them to abandon positions, but it was pretty clear that we were bringing up stuff that hadn't been thought of before or thought of in depth before, and that people were, appreciated what we'd done. But again, we were working with the various offices out there. None of this was going to be published and, blow them away because they'd never seen it before. They already knew what was coming out because we were working with them. So the idea that they would, suddenly look at this and go, wait a minute, that's probably not going to happen. I'm trying to remember the exact piece you and I worked on. I think it's the one that I was working on for Admiral Stavridis, but because that was one of the 2 or 3 Navy pieces I did. But I think that one had the potential to cause people to think. Yeah, I mean, it caused my bosses to think, but that one also was a little more science fiction-y, frankly.
Yeah, it was. It was.
But I think we had 2 or 3 pieces. My biggest piece caused a lot of stir. I think that people had not thought that this problem might go in this direction before. So it caused a lot of stir. But as far as changing minds or whatnot, that was really hard to know for sure. So basically, we would, put an effort into it, and we might get a lot of hits, we might not, and hopefully we're having that kind of an impact. But basically, I was looking at, the leadership may not have thought of this before, but the leadership is the leadership. They're not experts in every little field. Maybe that helps somebody next time they go to brief the director or whatever. And then I thought a lot about the very junior analysts who, might read this stuff and go, hey, that's interesting. Maybe I can apply this kind of thinking to my work. So.
All All right, thank you very much, Chip. So now we're going to turn to Steve Sallott, who Steve is, former Leavenworth guy. I'll let you explain fully what that means. I'll just start off by saying I first encountered the red team folks at Leavenworth when one of them, Colonel Fontenot, came to the Naval War College to do a very, very, very short seminar. As in, normally it's a 3-week thing, but he did it in 3 hours on exactly what red teaming was. And I went thinking that it was about how to play red in a war game. And boy, was I wrong. So it was a lot more than that. So Steve, over to you.
All right. Good morning. And thanks, Chris, for inviting me to the panel. My name is Steve Sallott. As you mentioned, real quick, I'm going to tell you a little bit of who I am. Then I'm going to kind of go with some background, talk about red teaming, why we red team. I'll give you my view. And since I'm no longer on a company who does red teaming, I can tell you what I think red teaming is versus what the company position is. So that I find that a little liberating. And then kind of at the end, I'll kind of summarize some characteristics, first principles, and just some general overview of kind of my perception or perspective on red teaming. But a little bit about who I am to kind of give you a little context. So if you haven't read in the bio, I was an instructor at the University of Foreign Military and Cultural Studies, the Army School for Red Teaming, and also by de facto, the DoD official school for red teaming for about 6 years. I was also operationally involved with the CENTCOM Red Team. I ran that for 2 years at the U.S. Central Command. And then I also served at the ISAF Red Team. So I had probably about 8 years or so of operational and instructing red team. Both as an instructor, we did also active red teaming and things like that for customers and things like that. So additionally, I've got a background in intelligence and operations research and wargaming, which kind of makes me a nice utility infielder and served as a joint planner. Again, gives me a broad sense of ability to use kind of the red team tradecraft throughout my career. And I used it very much when I was assigned to a UN mission in Africa, MINUSCA, which was the mission to Central African Republic, where I was the chief of U2, so in charge of intel and information for the UN mission there. So that's a little bit about who I am. So if I haven't wooed you with my resume on why you should listen to me about red teaming, I guess I have failed that part. But before I really get started, I want to go to the next slide, please. And I want to talk about, well, one more. That was the around the horn, what we're going to do. The typology of red teaming. So this is really to provide a little bit of context for the rest of my pitch, but also kind of put in what is red teaming, kind of the theme of the panel. I put this together about 10 years ago. It's hard to believe it's been that long. What I did was I took from the source documents words that were used to describe or was related to red teaming. You notice there's kind of the primary sources on the left-hand side, and you'll notice that it goes into two camps. The first camp, the active red teaming, which we've heard a lot from our previous guests so far, panel members. That's kind of the active side of red teaming. That is penetration, computers, hacking, things to that nature. Threat emulation, the red cell type activity. The other part of it is the passive side. That's where you get to the critical thinking and how to make better decisions and things like that. But again, these are all words that we often hear in the community synonymous used with red team or red teaming. The short of it is it's all right. It is all red teaming. So we're not going to parse and say this is not red teaming. This is all it, right? And what I'm going to talk to you about is kind of the lower right corner, the decision support and critical review. So that's kind of the red teaming school that I grew up in. Most of it was bureaucratic because somebody else had the mission to do threat emulation. Probably had they not had a bureaucratic fight for the rice bowl, we probably would have had all three. But nonetheless, we focused on the decision support and critical review. And if you kind of backtrace that, it kind of goes up into all those other things, which is the wargaming and red cell. But fundamentally, it's about making better decisions. So whether you're a threat emulator or you're critically reviewing a product to make it better, it didn't matter. You're just trying to make better decisions for the blue people. Our commanders, our decision makers, our policy makers. That's what it is all about, was kind of making better decisions. All right, let's go to the next slide. So I have a number of slides, but we're gonna keep them simple, mostly as a build. But here, so now we're gonna move on to why to red team. All right, so you can read the quote there from the 35th Chief of Staff of the Army of when Greg Fontenot stood up the red team in 2005 and 2006. Fundamentally, he was charged with, that is Greg Fontenot, was charged with just changing the way we think in the military, specifically the Army. At this time, we had about 2 or 3 years into the Iraq War, about 5 years into the war in Afghanistan, and then, of course, other places across the globe. And we just weren't doing what we usually thought we would do, is go in and win quickly and be done. So what was going on? So it was about thinking differently. We had a problem with how we thought. And that's normal, because at the end of the day, there's plenty of psychological research and sociological research that says this, is that we all don't think very well. We all fall victim to the same basic problems in terms of cognitive biases and heuristics. For instance, confirmation bias is one of those things where we look and we see what we want to see and ignore discounting information. Availability bias. Oh, it never happened. You know, we talked about writing science fiction. When at CENTCOM, I get accused a lot of writing fiction, but not more times than not. A few times those things that were fiction come to pass. So it's not necessarily, it's just about thinking differently and being creative and open to new ideas. So confronting availability bias. The other reason why we need a red team is we got this thing called groupthink, right? Where we're predisposed, or normative conformity oversees and dominates information conformity. What that really means is our social needs and interests override how we really truly think about a problem. So we will go along and we will jump on the bandwagon. We'll say, yes, sir. We'll say, no, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. We just get on with it, and without thinking critically about what's going on in the world. So there's a lot of reasons why we should red team. And fundamentally what it is human beings, we don't think very well. And truly what I mean by that is, if you read the research on cognitive research, neuroscientists and things like that, you got the system 1, system 2 brain going, and system 1 will always override system 2. And we have to really stop and think to kick into system 2, and think of system 2 as kind of your cerebral deep thinker, and your system 1 is the lazy brain. And lazy brain wants to find patterns, and system 2 will, as soon as it finds a pattern, it'll accept it. So you have to really kick system 2 into override to think better. So fundamentally, we just don't think very well, and that's why we need a red team. All right, next slide, please. All right, so this is Steve's view. With all that being said, in the bottom left-hand corner, you can kind of take a quick little read of kind of how I've, I guess, defined, is the lack of a better word, but put red teaming in a box. And what I want to emphasize is that it's a mindset. And some people will say it's a function. Some people will say it's a group of trained practitioners that will do certain things, or you'll follow a certain set of structured analytical techniques or algorithms, red team tools and techniques, sometimes they're called. But that's not the case. It's really about a mindset. It's about stepping outside your worldview. If you can't step outside your worldview, you'll be locked in your own, and you'll be subject to those same cognitive biases and things that already fail your thinking. And the reason why that's important, because you can't break availability bias if you are stuck in your own world. And oh, by the way, who says that your world is right? So it's about changing the matrix, so to speak. Your perception of you're living in the matrix from that old movie a few years ago. Just, you live in the matrix. What's your perception of it, and how do you change it? The other key words in there, it's about exploration. So really, what's that? That's just fancy for like, hey, let's suspend it and tear it apart, interrogate it, and look for new ideas and new linkages and new causes and new outcomes. Critical review, that is what you got to think critically to be a red teamer. And it's really fundamentally about understanding the problem better, to improve decision making and to achieve better outcomes. So fundamentally, how I see this is really, it's a mindset. It's just a way of how you approach looking at problems. Are you okay with the simple, I got an answer, I'm right, I got to fight to be right? Or are you more interested in what are the different perspectives that influence this? And then ultimately, it's got to lead to better decisions and better outcomes. Because if not, then you're just not improving the product. you're just being a naysayer. And if you've ever done this professionally, you can only do this once or twice before you get put in the corner and nobody listens to you. So fundamentally, you've got to make whatever somebody is doing, make it better. And you got to do that through kind of suspending your judgment and moving to a new worldview. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, so that's kind of my pitch on what red teaming is. And before I move on, I just want to kind of highlight the fact that this is what you're going to get next is just kind of a list of kind of like core ideas or core principles, tenets, ways I describe red teaming depending on who the audience is. But nonetheless, I thought it was a good collection of kind of like lists of other buzzwords that might be helpful in understanding this concept of red teaming to make better decisions. All right, next slide, please. We're going to start with the characterization. I already mentioned it's a mindset. It's about enhancing understanding. That stuff is easy. But what I'd also say that red teaming is hard. It takes a lot of mental energy to do this. I was often especially when I was teaching, people ask you what you do. You're like, well, I teach critical thinking. And they're like, so do you think critically? And I said, well, sometimes, because it is really hard and you have to turn that red team brain on. That's why I say it's a mindset. The other aspect is red team the red team. So if you're willing to challenge somebody else's assumptions, you should be willing to challenge your own. And that's why it's always important from a red team perspective is you're not the smartest person in the room. Even if you thought you were the smartest person in the room, you can't act like it. And you sure probably are not, because somebody probably has something of information or a value that you do not have that you need to make a better and more informed estimate of the situation. So again, you got to kind of challenge yourself, challenge your assumptions, and challenge those around you. Also, I would say from a red team perspective, looking into the future. Like if you're not looking into the future and seeing how the second, third order effects would be, you're doing a disservice to that decision support aspect that's required. Again, also red teaming is kind of seeing that there's change in the environment. Very little stays the same. The status quo may be the status quo on the surface, but what's below the surface? Like if you take an iceberg analogy, on the top, it's kind of going really slow, but on the underneath, what's going on? Again, there's always going to be some change. And lastly, you got to make the product better. So it's the BASF effect. For those who used to watch TV many years ago, it's just about how's this company make things better? They don't make the tape, they make the tape better. So make their product, make it better. All right. So before I kind of move on, but we got to talk about this other elephant in the room, kind of when not to red team. This is just as important as when to red team. But fundamentally, we forget that sometimes there's not a time and place for that. And principally, it's mostly time. So if you're in the middle of a crisis event or in the middle of a breach in an obstacle belt or something like that, or a minefield with a ship, it's not time to think about what are your options and what's the best. It's like, let's get out of the firefight and get to safety. Then we'll figure out the best way to save fuel or optimize fuel consumption, things like that. Organizational cultures, again, that's very important. And lastly, this is more about protecting the brand and protecting the kind of the intellectual integrity of the process. Is sometimes you get requests to red team courses of action, plans, or ideas that the decision makers already decided, and they're not going to change it, and they're predisposed, and they want you to put a stamp of approval on it. So if it goes bad, that we red teamed it and it just was unlucky or whatever the case may be. But those are usually good times to not red team, and if you can, push away from the requirement. All right, I'm going to move up to the three thinkings real quick. What I'm looking at here in the three thinkings is it's a critical thinking, creative thinking, and strategic thinking. So you kind of caught those themes all the way through. But if you're doing those that's what the essence of red teaming is, those three thinkings: thinking critically about problems, challenging assumptions, being creative, finding what's different, what else is missing, what are we not seeing in our blind spots, what are we forgetting, what's our cultural disposition to prevent us from seeing. It goes back to mirror imaging. It was one of the panel members mentioned before, trying to combat mirror imaging. And finally, thinking strategically. That's both in terms of interdependent decision making. What's the best decision given an adversary is going to make a decision, but also what's the second, third order effects? Where does this go into the future, and how does this end? That's always a great question I asked as a planner. I was not well received generally by the senior leadership when I'd ask this question. Anyways, so we're going to move the first principles right there. Again, this is how I kind of cap red teaming as a skill set. Really is about suspending your judgment. You're slowing your down your thinking, making the implicit explicit. And that really becomes important as you're looking at challenging your assumptions. But that's also what the red team techniques are really good for. Using a structured analytical technique forces you to put your thoughts and why you believe something to be true on paper, so allow you and others to actually suspend it, move it around, interrogate it, and tear it apart. That's probably the most important aspect of red teaming. Also, we're looking at mitigating cultural bias. Not easy to do. Just a short plug. I think tomorrow at 16:30 Eastern time, we're going to do a 1-hour workshop where we go through the 6 empathetic questions. We're doing attempts to achieve a level of strategic empathy and understand how an adversary might, or another agent might, perceive the world and what might be important to them. And then finally, I would just say, what else? What's in the blind spots? What are we not looking? That's where the value of the red team is, and breaking that availability bias. So I am out of time. So that will be my summary as well. And I'll look forward to your questions later.
All right. Thank you, Steve. That typology chart, by the way, is a pretty good summary of exactly why I wanted to do this panel. Because there's a lot of different language there, there's a lot of different pieces there, and people have a tendency to put themselves in like one little part, one little color segment of that, but not everybody is in the exact same segment. So somebody asked a question, Mark Hitchcock, good to see you, Mark. Mark asked a specific question of, can you give an example of red teaming facilitating a better outcome and how it impacted, he says, a war game audience, but any audience. I mean, I'm very familiar with the idea that a lot of times you're the equivalent of whispering to the Roman emperor that he's mortal. And as a general rule, people that reach flag rank don't like being told that. So do you have any specific examples that you can talk about where it had that kind of impact?
Yeah. So specifically at CENTCOM, we were very transparent. So even though there's kind of this idea that you whisper to the emperor and no one else gets to hear, ISAF was completely different. The ISAF was very much to the comm ISAF, and nobody else would know what was going on. It was very disappointing. But to that end, I think we had kind of a success where on a Friday morning we came in and we listened to a kind of a I guess like the commander's update, and we had lost access to or control over the theater reserve element. It was switched to another COCOM based on some other perspective. I'll just keep it at that to try to keep it vague enough for the audience. And we immediately looked at each other and said, that doesn't make any sense. So we went and looked at the current intel and looked for indications and warning, and went to the indications and warning board, and we're looking for whatever it is that was going to drive this. And we immediately put together kind of a like a point paper that's about 1.5 pages and pushed it up through the chain, and it resulted in the reattachment or reassignment of the theater reserve back to our COCOM. But I know I got like 6 examples, but I can't think of any at the moment. I had pre-made, because I get this question all the time when you're out petitioning what's red teaming. But that's one of the ones that I think that comes to mind that says a red team can make a difference. And I think we did it because we had a large distribution network. We had any typical day, we would send about 600 emails, our products, when we would publish a piece. Over.
Okay, so Steve said that he's going to do a workshop tomorrow at 16:30. It says in the schedule 1600, but we're actually going to kick off at 16:30. It had to do with how we set up things in tabletop events, and sort of it was easier. It's going to be easier just to park me in the space and say, "Hang on, everybody, come back in a half hour. We'll do it then," than it is to try to fix it on the computer side of things. So thank you very much, Steve. Last but certainly not least is Doug Clifford from the Center for Advanced Red Teaming at the University of Albany. And so to be honest, Doug, your shop is the one that I knew the least about in terms of exactly where it is that you sort of fit into things. So I am really looking forward to hearing what you have to say about this. So over to you.
Great, thanks, Chris. Good afternoon, everybody. And Chris, that's good to hear. And I think I've kind of catered my notes here for this presentation around the actual work that we do, and not so much on the theory behind it, as I think that will kind of help things be a little bit less abstract. So as others have all said, red teaming can mean a lot of different things, right? We all know that. And in many ways, I think the red teaming we do is a bit different, as Chris kind of alluded to, so I'm going to focus on that. I'll first describe our center, our mission, and then dive into the actual red teaming exercises we engage in to achieve our mission. I think this will be the best way to portray what we mean by red teaming. And so our research center, the Center for Advanced Red Teaming, or for short, CART, is an academic research center located at the University at Albany, within the College of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security, and Cybersecurity. We did not pick the name, by the way. It's a bit long, which provides us direct access to experts in social science, intelligence analysis, cybersecurity, AI, AR/VR, for collaboration, which we leverage a lot for the work that we do. It just makes sense to leverage those resources. So our mission, in short, is to improve the art and science of red teaming in its most basic sense. So what does that mean, right? Great, that's a little bit vague. So what it means is that we use theoretically informed and scientifically replicable adversary emulation. So you've heard that term kind of thrown around a little bit from the previous presenters, to answer complex questions, often in limited data contexts, to inform homeland security and national security enterprises. So I'll break down some of that meaning and give examples of the work that we do related to that mission through various exercise designs in our research. So I'll start with theoretically informed. So as an example, we explored the theory of restrictive deterrence, which comes from criminology, and how different security measures can deflect adversaries from attacking specific targets. So we developed a red teaming exercise where participants played the role of the adversary, and it explored various transportation security environments and the impact that varying security measures in those environments had on attacker decision-making. So this was done in an online asynchronous format, actually, and I'll discuss more about some of those details here in a few minutes. Another example is some work that we conducted on strategic decision factors, which comes from the political science world, where we explored how some leaders might pursue offensive BW weapons as a result of COVID-19 impacts. So in that exercise, which was also done using an online asynchronous approach, they played the role of various country leaders, and participants included 300 experts from multiple disciplines from all over the world. So we utilized that approach to really reach a broad audience. Regarding scientifically replicable, always hard for me to say that word, we developed structured instruments that can be repeatedly run, allowing us to scale data collection on emulated adversary behaviors in its basic sense. We also use as much of the best survey design practices as we can in our exercises. Allows us to capture structured sequential decision-making throughout the course of an exercise. This includes using injects, which many of you in the wargaming community and beyond are very familiar with, throughout the course of an exercise, followed by inquiries into the impact that they have on adversary decision-making. And very commonly, we also include the why. I feel like sometimes that is lost. So what decision did you make and why did you make that decision? We've also run exercises in which injects or even the initial scenario details vary across our participants. And this can help evaluate how these differences impact their decisions, similar to how you would randomly assign an experimental treatment in a social science research question, right? So similar kind of idea. To keep tying things back to our mission, for adversary emulation, for that aspect of it, we leverage role identification approaches. This includes role immersion techniques, and we also include bias awareness training. So, you know, there's obvious arguments about mitigating bias or removing bias, and that it's not quite possible. We aim to raise awareness of them, and then and for role immersion, the idea is to help red teamers kind of better empathize, but of course not sympathize with the adversaries that they're simulating, right? In the roles that they're playing. One way that we try to help with role immersion, as an example, is to have participants, when they get in role and they've received their role information, is to do some journaling in role of a childhood experience that individual has gone through, right? It just helps kind of get into that mindset and get out of their own personal mindset. We create detailed adversary backgrounds when it's appropriate for the exercise across structured dimensions, whose variation can also be important in testing, right? So, for example, similar to the variation in scenarios that I just mentioned, differences in ideologies or resource levels of the adversary, which goes back to some of the comments about playing red in wargaming, an exercise. So we test things like that as well. As you all know, these things matter when individuals are making decisions, right? So again, to tie back to the mission, so complex questions. There's a few complex questions that we deal with. One would be, how do you help customs officials self-identify vulnerabilities in their export control, licensing, and inspection processes? That's quite an endeavor. So we're attempting to answer this by creating a red teaming approach. It's structured, this one, as an in-person, TTX style exercise in which licensing and customs officials play the role of both the red and blue team separately, of course, over the course of several rounds. Red is not scripted. This allows for an adaptive red to develop their actions over time, much as you would see like in a war game, right? It also allows blue to go through the various phases of their policies and procedures, adjudicating the actions of red. So it's not just red does all this and blue, what are you going to do? There's a lot of back and forth. The blue team throughout that process also receives noise that the white team creates in advance. So if everything is a red action, right, then there's no way to test your ability to identify them. So in this effort, we create some noise in there as well. And the noise, for those who might not know, are just actions that are non-adversarial, right? Things that they would see in their normal day-to-day activities. Even more challenging in this endeavor is that this also includes a train-the-trainer aspect as well. So the idea is that we want to transfer the capability so it can be used in-house, so that folks can kind of dig a little bit deeper without us being involved, which oftentimes is what's desired. One other complex question we're seeking to answer, how do you improve intellectual property security and general research security for proliferation-sensitive technologies produced in university and industry environments in the US, but also in partner nations, right? So again, we're trying to answer this by creating a red teaming exercise, this one being synchronous, but it is remote, in which researchers, academics, and various officials within partner nations play the role of the blue team, attempting to both identify first and then ultimately adjudicate the red actions against them. Now, these actions and attempts are predetermined and scripted. So this is not an adaptive exercise. This is more about evaluating blue. The red actions include attempts to obtain information on proliferation-sensitive technologies. And again, those are developed in advance. But what we do is we use historical cases to ground those, so they're plausible, right? We don't just come up with them out of nowhere. But we also include some emerging cases, right? Because the adversary adapts. We can't just go with all the things that happened 15, 20 years ago. And particularly those that are happening right now in gray areas related to dual-use technologies. And we use that as a basis for the red actions in that endeavor. A few more points related to our mission. So in limited data contexts, so how do you address a question when you can't ask a large sample of adversaries, right? There just simply is not enough data there. Run a red teaming exercise, right? If it's not the best thing, right? Maybe it's the next best thing. Maybe it is the best. So, so this has not really been tested, that no one's really evaluated this. So one way we tried to address this was in the visual deterrence exercise that I mentioned just a few minutes ago, in which we scaled our research. Again, this is an online asynchronous exercise, so this was a little bit easier, to 2,000 participants nationwide. And it allowed us to identify deterrent qualities across different population subsamples. So just as a few examples, men versus women, those with arrest records versus those without. So they're just ways to see the difference in response across a larger sample. While these individuals are not adversaries themselves, they were simulating the role of the adversary. So in this case, they did receive role information, scenario information, and they played that role. Regarding the Homeland Security and National Security enterprises, so we've done work or currently doing work for various entities within DHS to include TSA, Customs and Border Patrol. We also do work with the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, or DTRA, at DoD. We have some work with the State Department, various industry partners, and several different associations. We were recently part of a red teaming exercise that was actually run for the Society of Actuaries, looking at catastrophic cyber risk. We've also completed or have upcoming work in over 15 different countries across Northern Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Asia, Southeast Asia. So there's a lot of folks not only interested in this, but in areas where we're seeking to apply it where it's not being applied. And by that, I mean red teaming. So in short, I know that was kind of rapid fire, but we focus on leveraging the best of the scientific method where we can, coupled with subject matter expertise, which a lot we find in our college and at our university, to improve and extend red teaming as a viable research method for challenging security questions. So I hope that gives kind of a bit of an overview of what we do at the center. Again, I apologize for the fire hose. I wanted to keep myself within time. But if anybody wants to talk any further about the work that we do, or about any of the projects that I mentioned, please reach out. I know Chris has my contact information and several others, so I'd be happy to talk further. So thanks, Chris.
Okay, thank you very much. So one of the things that I noticed is sort of a recurring theme, which is, we're at a wargaming conference, so this worked out well for me. There's a recurring theme of everybody seems to have some flavor of wargaming experience, more or less. I know, that's not surprising for some of you because, I mean, for instance, I met Sean through Hobby Wargaming originally, but before I was in the DoD wargaming business myself. As I had said, that Chip and I had been orbiting each other, and Ed McGrady's the person who pointed me in the direction of Nina, and I had spent a lot of time working with doing wargaming stuff with Ed. So how often do you folks end up having the conversation about how wargaming relates specifically to the flavor of red teaming you're doing? And do you find, like I do, that I find myself in a lot of conversations where people will use the phrase red team, and I'll have to say, stop right there. We very specifically need to be specific about what we mean by that, because you all think that communication is taking place, and I am unconvinced as of this point in the conversation. Doug, since I haven't asked you a specific question, why don't I start with you? How often do you have to do stuff like that?
Yeah, so I think to your first point, we really do. There's a lot of synergies, obviously, between what we do and wargaming, right? So anytime you're simulating the role of an adversary, right, that's commonly done in wargaming. And you're simulating the role of blue, right? I mean, in its essence, right? I mean, what's variably different between what we're doing in that space and wargaming, right? So there are a lot of synergies there. I think some of the dynamic that I end up having to explain is that, and this might be the case for folks wargaming as well, is the difference of when you can or should, and there's argument there, script red or script blue. So what are you actually trying to evaluate? What are you actually seeking to answer? So I think that's something that commonly comes up. I will say a lot of what I've run into is in what is red teaming. I actually find a lot of like the space where Nina resides is where a lot of people immediately go to as far as red teaming. I think that's where a lot of people go. And in second place would be where Steve has been doing a lot of his work. So I think that is kind of what I end up finding. So I do find that I have to do the same thing, Chris. Like, wait. So what do you mean by red teaming? Or oftentimes when I say, so I'm involved in red teaming work. So what do you mean red teaming, right? And it involves a pretty in-depth description, which is very far from what they envisioned it being. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
no, it does. It does. Yeah. I wanted just to see if it was just me, but apparently it's not. Is there anybody who hasn't had that experience? Okay, that's pretty much what I expected. There's been a vigorous discussion taking place in chat, and I hope that all of you get a chance to go and look at it after the fact, and maybe throw some stuff up in the comments section. Once we're done broadcasting, the chat section piece of it will be unavailable, but you can put comments in YouTube. One question, though, in specific, asked by Jeff Beeler, is what are some good unclassified sources to use how to think red? And I guess I would start by saying, just, thinking red is sort of like, what do you mean by red teaming? I've already tossed out the University of Foreign Military and Cultural Studies Red Team Handbook and the British equivalent thereof into the chat. But is there anything else that, by the way, Sean has not died. Sean just has a meeting he needs to go to. So he is currently working on moving towards his car so he can drive off to his office for a meeting. And any suggestions that people have on what people should be reading?
All right, I'll take a stab, but it's not going to be it's going to be an initial blast. I'd say you're not going to find anything that's going to tell you how to think red. What you have to do is really go back to, I think Chip was talking about like that, or actually our first one, Sean, like thinking the cultural perspective. So if you have a specific adversary or a specific target, whether it's Venezuela, Peru, or Nebraska, whatever the case may be, kind of dig into their culture and look at their kind of who their heroes are and things like that. So there's a number of cultural techniques to go through there, but looking at art, looking at literature, understand the culture, because the decision processes that they make is more important. And then when you can read a book about how they do TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedure, but it doesn't make a lot of sense till you understand kind of how that cultural brain thinks and what's important to them. And I mean, I always joke, one of the exercises I run my students with is why we fight. So if you don't know, that's a kind of a kickback to who's the guy who did that? Made propaganda films in the 40s for America.
Capra,
that's it. It's kind of a joke, like why we fight. And if you look at these things, you're like, holy smokes, this is I mean, horrifically propaganda, not even factually correct, but it didn't matter. But anyways, it's this why we fight and what makes them tick. I know it's not a good answer, but what I would say is it's probably the indirect approach. Like the sword and the chrysanthemum and the sword is a good example from the Japanese era, where anthropologists basically dissected the Japanese culture before to help inform decisions of whether to drop the bomb or invade Japan and things like that. Over.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in real quick because something that I meant to say earlier that I haven't. First of all, when Steve was talking about how human psychology works, etc., there's a really good book that is required reading in the intelligence community by Richards Hewer, and yes, Richards. Apparently, his first name is plural. Called The Psychology of Intelligence Analysis. It's available. It's available as a PDF. I have never encountered a community that spends as much time asking itself the question, how do I know that, as the intelligence community does. And in the intelligence community, the Central Intelligence Agency leads the way in asking that question. And so Richard Hewer had such an impact on the intelligence community that I believe they named the library after him, right? Is that right, Chip? Is it the library or the school? So CIA
Wasn't the school.
it was this, they basically named CIA named its school after him because he had such impact. And that book, yeah. And you can just do a search for that. It's available as a PDF, and it's fantastic. So anyone else have any reading recommendations of where you can point people to in general terms, in the specifics of your discipline, whatever?
Before I ever joined the IC, I read, and I know this might sound kind of hokey, but I read Victor Suvorov's books. I later met him, and he put a real big bruise on my chest with a practical demonstration of his theories. But at any rate, he really made me think how differently that his side thought from ours, and that really set me off on a course. Also, just a couple of things that are a little bit more relevant to this discussion is the book that I was referencing earlier, Micah Zenko's Red Team. I don't know that I can vouch for everything that he had in there, but his description of CIA Red Cell was pretty good, and I was there when some of the stuff he talks about happened. So, and then one of our guys, Mark Henshaw, wrote a novel called Red Cell, and it might not be the greatest novel ever written, but it actually is pretty good in describing how Red Cell thinks about things. So it's quite useful to take a look at.
I'll take some follow up on this. I think that a lot of people, if you're going to game hackers, cyberspace, info disruption, and look for motives and sort of incentives, why do people do that work? Why do people help each other? Why do people any of that? It's not a book so much as it is it's an audible set of stories. But there's a podcast called Darknet Diaries, which does a tremendous job. It's hosted by a guy named Jack Reciter, and if you're completely wedded to reading, you can just read the transcripts. But it really tale by tale sort of unpacks what it's like to think with those mindsets and the motivations behind which either hacking groups or individuals end up doing the work that they do, both malicious and what we call white hat, or sort of to increase security.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, so let's see. I said at the beginning that we never go 2 hours. I was wrong. So next question, let's go to Mark Hitchcock. So he says, addressing bias is an important part of wargaming for Red and Blue. Can you talk about how you address bias with the audience when conducting a war game, or, for that matter, when you're briefing leadership, right? Generals get to be generals because they have absolutely no bias. Isn't that correct? I suspect the answer is no. So everybody has to address bias. How do you folks do it? And I'll give a war game perspective eventually, because I'm going to take over the wargaming hat now that Sean's gone. So who wants to start? Should I start? Okay. I'll go ahead and start. I think my question to that, Mark, or my answer to that is, it really kind of depends upon it. In part, it depends upon what you're trying to do in the specific war game, because sometimes what you're trying to do is you're trying to provide an experience that will overcome the bias that the audience has. In fact, I made the reference to the UK. I think I made a reference to the UK Wargaming Handbook. No, I talked about their red teaming manual. I'm going to talk about their Wargaming Handbook at 3:00 today. The UK Wargaming Handbook, one of the things I like about it is it's got some really good examples in it. And in one of them, they talk about a merger between FMC and the head of FMC, who was like a former Army officer or senior level Army officer. He had this idea that they needed to merge with this particular company, and everybody thought it was a horrible idea. But he's the boss. He's the chairman of this billion-dollar corporation, and nobody was willing to just sort of go up and say, "Boss, this is a really crappy idea." But it came out in the war game that they did, and finally the boss said something like, "How come nobody told me this was such a dumb idea?" And the answer was there was just like dead silence, and then somebody said, "Because it was your idea, boss." And I guess to his credit, he understood that. But sometimes what you're trying to do is, I've seen instances where people specifically want to use a war game as a way of giving people experience with something that they've been trying to explain to leadership for a while, right? It's don't tell, show. Show, don't tell. And so war games can be a way of doing show, don't tell. Other than that, I think it really depends upon what exactly you're trying. What is the reason for red? What is red's mandate? Sometimes the purpose of red in a war game is to throw as many fastballs as they can and let blue do batting practice. That can be both in a case if it's like a training or educational game. It can also be a case if you're just trying to test things, right? If what you're trying to do is test concepts, you may not want to have a red that is a fully functioning, thinks like red. What you want is a red that's going to attack blue in a particular way so that blue can see if blue can resist that, or so that blue gets practice resisting that. Other times, you really just kind of need to immerse yourself in what red's like. If you're testing the war plan, you probably should have some fidelity to what red's going to do against the war plan. If you're really testing something like naval-based defense, you want them to attack the naval bases, whether or not red would do that in the real world or not. Somebody else gets to make the decision about whether that naval-based defense capability has utility in a world where they're not going to attack the naval base. That's not your call. That's somebody else's call. So anybody else have any thoughts on how to address bias? So I think, Steve, did you raise your hand first?
I did. Well, no, somebody else can go. I was.
Right, Doug, let's start with you then.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I was just going to bring up a different approach to this. And so for us, it's where we have to address biases is the participants in our exercise, right? I think I hinted at that a little bit in my speaking notes before. This is actually something that the folks on our team kind of go back and forth with a lot, right? Because, everybody talks about mitigating bias and try to reducing bias and that kind of thing. But there's a lot of conversation, at least amongst ourselves. Is that appropriate? Most people don't act without bias, right? So, are you really trying to mitigate bias? Or for us, if you have people emulating an adversary, are you trying to create certain biases? Now, that comes with its own concerns, right? And, being at a university, obviously, IRB comes to mind, right? And like, are you, influencing your participants? And that's a whole nother discussion. However, I think it's important to think about, and I'm gonna use this term, as all of you will probably appreciate. It depends. So like it depends on your participants, right? So as an example, if you have some folks trying to, let's say, play the role of individuals invading another country, we'll just say, those individuals are going to be acting with a certain bias in that act, right? So do you actually want to eliminate all bias before they go and they take part in that exercise? So, from one extreme to the next, I would just be repeating examples. So I won't get into that. But essentially, the idea that not only does it depend on the context, like you mentioned, Chris, but also it depends on the bias, right? I hope that helps, but all it does is overly complicate the conversation. So.
Yeah, I see multiple instances in war games where, we spend a lot of time modeling all the different factions within blue. I say factions, what I mean is organizations, right? But there are organizational bias, and we spend all this time modeling all those. And red is this monolithic unitary actor because it's the 3 red guys from the Intel community shop that we had come over to play red. And it's like, so first of all, we may not actually know what their plan really would be. And second of all, it's likely that there's some disagreement on the red side because they're human beings, and human beings disagree, and they have organizational biases. And third, there's always the chance that the local commander is going to blow him off anyway and do his own thing. And so a lot of war games I see have absolutely no capability to capture any of that stuff. And paradoxically, the only people who seem to think that that's a problem are the people who are called upon to play red. The people that are actually the unitary actors are going like, guys, this isn't actually how those guys work. So, Steve, did you have something?
Just add on real quick. Instead of trying to combat it or mitigate it, sometimes I highlight it, build the game system to highlight that's probably the old red team had in me to begin with when I designed the war game, is to pull those strings on the things that, okay, what's blue anchored on that's not quite right. They have maybe a bad assumption or a fragile assumption. Let's highlight that in the game and let them learn from that. So the other side of it is if you can't shake them, it's always the indirect approach. So I'll put a stochastic element to it in terms of like posture and AB or access spacing and overflight, those type of high order diplomatic information capabilities. Oh yeah, we're going to do an information campaign and we're going to shift the will of the people towards us. Okay, buddy, just roll a die. We'll see what happens. Just to kind of negate some of that. Well, if I do this, therefore I will achieve an advantage. Well, maybe not. So let's just roll.
Nina,
you've all jogged my thoughts. First I thought I don't have anything to say about this, and now I think I do. But so in many of the games that we play in the hackerspace, they're really about a logic of discovery, not really sort of trying to replicate with some degree of verisimilitude someone's decision space. And what I've really sort of seen over the last decade plus of hacker gaming is that there was a sort of a strange way in which we fell into the grooves of solving problems in certain ways. And the more broad, young, and I think just sort of weirder the hacker community got over the last several years, we started to see different approaches to discovery, and we were sort of surprised each other in the ways in which we had sort of thought we knew how to go about, sort of bypassing a magnet or sort of defeating a sensor. And just sort of as a quick analog, so it's a series of physical pen test challenges, and one of them was that you had to sort of remove the centerpiece of this bomb in order to get down there and pull the pin. And watch this woman walk in with, I think she just pulled it from her sweater, just a piece of thread that she had looped at the end, and she didn't even bother removing the centerpiece, which was like 30 minutes worth of work. And she just sort of looped the thread down under there, captured the pin, and just plucked it up. And the entire audience was just like gobsmacked, right? We were like, oh my gosh, we've been thinking about this all the wrong way. And so I think just the sort of, particularly in games of discovery where you're trying to find new pathways, is the importance of having so many different kinds of brains at the table, like just so many different kinds of people. So in that sense, sort of biasing who your audience is can really hamstring how you're getting at problem solving.
Okay. All right. So I think as a practical matter, we're about at the point where we should think about calling it, even though I suspect we could probably go on for another at least half hour. There is one thing I wanted to say real quick, and then I'll give everybody a chance to have one last thing. The thing I wanted to say real quick is I saw that Aaron Dennison said something about, or Aaron Dennis, I'm sorry, let me get his name correctly, said something on Discord about, wouldn't it be great if we had a panel about red wargaming blue or something to that effect. I forget exactly how he said it. I couldn't quite find it. There is going to be a panel that's very much like that. Stephen Downs Martin from the Naval War College, Professor Emeritus Naval War College, is going to do how red war games should be an intelligence collection requirement. And I think he's going to talk about things like that in his talk. So that is, I believe, that's the one he's doing Thursday morning at 10 a.m. or at 11 a.m., I think. I think that he's doing one tomorrow morning at 9 and then one Thursday, or tomorrow morning at 10 and then one Thursday at 11. I can't even remember the times of my own conference. Okay, so any last thoughts on red teaming, wargaming, your particular discipline, where you're going to be, et cetera, et cetera? Steve, anything from you?
Yeah, I just put a shameless plug out. I believe the Red Team School is going to be refunded and should be kicking off next fiscal year. So if you're in the DoD, I think the UFMCS is going to open. Well, it's going to be a different name, but they're going to open their doors again. Over. Yeah,
they can't call it the same thing because then that would admit that it was the dumbest decision in the history of DoD to close that school. So
no comment.
So let's see. Chip, do you have any final thoughts? Chip, you just muted yourself. Nope, you're still muted. There you go.
Okay. All right, we're good to go. Now, the only thought I've got is that when you're doing this kind of work, you have to remember the taste you're going to leave in the mouths of the people that you're working against. And it's very important to, at worst, agree to disagree, but at best, take their viewpoints into consideration and try to smooth the feathers over as best you can and have a good working relationship. Because if you're out there playing Lone Ranger, just shooting up the countryside, you're probably not going to get invited back anyway. So
there was one time where I was a member of a red cell, and it was getting. I was a member of a wargaming red side in a game that was being played on a weekly basis in the Pentagon, and Blue was getting sort of quite annoyed. They were getting very testy about stuff, and in part it was because we weren't letting them do big hand little map sort of deal, just hand waving stuff away, and in part it was because the guy who was the head red was really putting it to them. And at one point when I was dealing with some particular testy officer, I just sort of looked at him and said, "Dude, we're all blue guys at heart. We're all on the same side. We're not going to give it to you because it doesn't help any of the guys that are actually going to end up fighting this war if we let you hand wave it away. So quit bitching and beat us. There is nothing that I would love better than to lose in this game. So do it." And that I actually had some resonance. That sort of calmed things down. Me getting testy calmed things down. So any other final comments from anybody?
Just a self-promotion. So Ed McGrady and I will be conducting a port hacking game again this year at DEF CON, August 10 through 13. And the build out this year will be that there's a just as a spoiler alert, and maybe just amongst us chickens online, we're going to try and add a cybersecurity red team to the game, as well as attach an actual network to it. So it should be a pretty interesting second round of experiments. So anybody who wants to come, let me know.
That sounds fantastic. Okay, Doug, any final thoughts from you?
Just as I mentioned before, I know I kind of gave a shotgun approach with all of our projects. Happy to chat more about those if anybody's interested. Definitely reach out. My contact information can be found on our center's website if you just search Center for Advanced Red Teaming, or can be provided by Chris and others on the team here. And just thanks to you, Chris, for letting me speak here.
All right. So thank you very much, everybody. If the panel could hang around after I end things so that we can do a little quick hot wash. But thank you very much, everybody, and have a great conference. Talk to you all soon.